Justice.
Justice.
Community.
Accountability.
Freedom.
Repair.
Liberation. Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change. Unlocking change.
Accountability. Community.
Accountability.
Repair, liberation.
Unlocking
change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
This is Colorado's Radio for Justice, and this is Unlocking Change. I'm your host, Michael Clifton.
And I'm your co-host, JoyBelle Phelan. Today, we sit down with Kristen Nelson, Executive Director of Spero Justice Center. It's a continuation of the conversation we began last time in the previous episode of Unlocking Change.
That's right, it's Kristen Nelson Part 2.
Previously, Kristen shared with us her journey as an attorney, from her early days working at the Southern Center for Human Rights to establishing the Spero Justice Center right here in Colorado, fighting to end extreme criminal sentencing.
Spero, Kristen says, is the Latin word for hope.
Now, we look with Kristen at present-day sentencing practices in Colorado and the United States, and she reflects on the possibility of a transformed system that is more humane.
Will we ever get there? Maybe not in my lifetime, but do I believe in things that I haven't seen or haven't yet seen? I do, right? But in the meantime, each person who is freed from a virtual life or actual life sentence, who gets to walk out of prison and hug their family and contribute to society, that's the best kind of narrative change that we can possibly have.
We jump back into this discussion with Kristen Nelson with you, Michael, sharing with Kristen about your own journey through prison and how that value of hope was pivotal to your success, both before and after your release.
Yes, right now, here on Unlocking Change.
In the Spero Justice Center, you guys focus on extreme sentences, right? And one of the reasons that I had a 98-year sentence was because of the crime of violence, right?
Yeah.
So it was 2 robberies, and from those 2 robberies, because the night robbery had 2 individuals, it was turned into 3 aggravated robberies, 3 kidnappings, 2 burglaries, and the crime of violence, which triggers mandatory sentencing.
And all
right?
of the enhancements that go with that.
Exactly. And so that's how my charges were stacked, ran consecutively, even though the judge had no discretion.
Right.
So, a couple of years ago, the crime of violence law was in the headlines, right? There was the driver who was driving the semi truck. It's received that extreme sentence. Police intervened even before that individual was sent to DOC. And there was a lot of talk about addressing the crime of violence law, right? Me being someone that was inside and knowing how powerful that law is, this tool for prosecutors, I was like, there's no way they're going to touch that law, right? And sadly, the talk and the conversation around that law went away because the prosecution has all the power once they invoke or, enact that charge. All bets is off. It's win or lose. There's no real in between. Plea bargain 75 years, and I keep going around it, but I did eventually end up getting clemency, thank God, after 24 and a half years. But can you kind of talk about what happened? What happened to addressing this law that seemed to be so extreme during this time, and it seemed like everybody was in a consensus when this case was in the headlines and Governor Post intervened and pardoned.
Well, actually, there was a change in the law that was passed. I want to say it was 23 or 24. And now I have to go back. Now I need to look. So if I can just refer to this here, in 2023, the Colorado legislature passed House Bill 1292, which provides for second look for violent and habitual sentences. And so the law allows crime of violence sentences that were imposed consecutively, like yours, Michael, if you were sentenced after the effective date of the law, to petition for modification after serving between 2 and 5 years. And for habitual offenders who were given sentences exceeding 24 years or greater, they can petition for a sentence modification after serving 10 years. And so these reforms apply prospectively, like I said. So they don't apply to anybody who's already in prison. Yeah. But it certainly was a step forward.
So, move forward, because that 2 to 10 years does give somebody some time to reflect, take accountability, have remorse, and also improve themselves and be able to demonstrate it if they get back into court. So
because it can take at least 5 years just to get into programming.
That was a modest a modest bill in some ways, but a really important step forward. But it was prospective only. And most criminal legal changes in Colorado are prospective only because of some very unique features to our Constitution and case law interpreting that Constitution, which is a huge challenge. So even if the legislative reforms had been bigger and bolder, they likely would only have been prospective and wouldn't have impacted anybody who had been sentenced
Who's still
before the change of the law.
Yep.
Yeah.
So and I was unaware of that, but what I guess I'm kind of concerned about, even though that is a step forward, is like even in 1998 when I was convicted under the crime of violence, the judge did have discretion to step outside of the statute under extreme conditions, right? And that you could come back and back then it was like, I think within 6 months you can come back. And to my knowledge, there was nobody that had ever been convicted that came back and had any relief under that extreme condition.
Yeah, to that point, no, you're exactly right. And that provision still exists today as well, where there's a very kind of short window of time where folks can kind of ask for reconsideration. But you've identified the problem. That may not be the most appropriate time to reconsider a person's sentence, because you can't really predict the future. No one has a crystal ball when judges are imposing these sentences, whether they have discretion or not, right? As to how a person might grow and change over the course of their sentence. And so that's why it is really important to try to figure out more opportunities for reconsidering long sentences, even in some cases decades after they've been imposed. And that's the challenge with the new law too. It's better, but even with that 5 to 10 year window,
So you've led up to this a little bit. So how do we deal with nothing ever looks backward? Like we all know a bunch of people in prison who have been there for a very long time that have done a whole lot of work on themselves. How do we help how do we look at that? Are there avenues where we can actually help people in those situations?
Yeah. I don't think there is one answer to that question. Obviously, there's clemency. What's interesting about clemency, right, which is the governor's power under our state constitution to essentially wave a magic wand and change a person's sentence. That's the sentence commutation portion of clemency, which is what we're talking about.
Yep.
Yeah. Back in the 70s and 80s, even Republican governors, well, actually maybe more like 60s and 70s, even Republican governors were routinely granting like hundreds of clemencies in Colorado every year. And then slowly over time, you see that number dwindle and dwindle and dwindle and dwindle until it's
down to 20.
Very, very, very rare today. Obviously, you were one of the exceptional ones, Michael, who received clemency. So I think we can advocate though for an expanded use of the governor's clemency power. So that's one. Two, there are a small number of district attorney's offices in Colorado right now. It's really just limited at this point to Jeffco and Denver, who have conviction integrity or conviction review units that are willing to look not only at cases of actual innocence, but cases where an excessive sentence may have been imposed decades earlier that may not make any sense anymore, either because the person has changed, the law has changed, or both.
Okay.
That process still requires sort of a legal basis to go back into court and change a person's either vacate the conviction or change the sentence through the process that we know here in Colorado called, that's governed by Colorado Rule of Criminal Procedure 35C. But it still provides a mechanism if you can identify a viable legal basis to get back into court and get the DA's agreement and support to go back into court and make an argument to the judge that there's something wrong that happened here that requires fixing. We've been able to achieve reliefs for a number of clients through collaborative partnership with the Jeffco and Denver conviction review units. And we're really, really grateful to our partners in the DA's office for supporting those client sentence reductions.
Yes.
Yep.
There are some other mechanisms that we can take advantage of. Spero was recently part of a coalition that achieved some legislative reforms this session to Colorado's medical parole or special needs parole statute that should make broaden pathways out of prison for elderly and seriously ill incarcerated folks. So we're excited to see how that unfolds, and we're hopeful that that will, kind of pave the way for more people with medical needs getting the care that they need to get in the community. There are a handful of other jurisdictions around the country that have been able to enact what we call like second look sentencing statutes, which would be kind of a broad statute that would allow or enable a person to kind of just go back into court and say to a judge, hey, judge, I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago. I've grown and changed over time. I think my sentence warrants some reconsideration. That kind of a statute in Colorado, for the reasons I just explained, because there's this old 1973 Colorado Supreme Court case interpreting the Colorado Constitution as giving the governor the exclusive power to reduce a sentence once it becomes final. That kind of a second look sentencing statute in Colorado would be difficult to achieve with the current legal kind of landscape that we have now. But we are, I'll put it this way, in coalition with others, thinking really seriously and creatively about ways around that. And, the kind of the core of the work that we're doing at Spero, whether it's through a conviction review unit or clemency, or some other avenue, is really trying to bring this like human centeredness to the case, to persuade the decision makers to see the humanity in our clients and to kind of get on board on a moral level that something went wrong here. It's another one of the great lessons that I learned through all of my years of capital work. There's this doctrine in death penalty jurisprudence called mitigation, which is sort of stands for the proposition that context matters, right? And in capital cases, a defendant has a constitutional right to have mitigation presented on their behalf if a jury is going to be deciding their sentence. But mitigation is not used as frequently in the non-capital context. And mitigation in all of the cases that we work on is really kind of the core of what we do. That context may not have come in at, in the person's criminal trial because it was not legally admissible or relevant in a strict legal sense, but it's highly morally relevant, right? We should care what the circumstances were that caused a person to find themselves in this situation, right? We should care whether a young man who ended up committing an act of gang violence, joined a gang after he was essentially abandoned by a drug addicted parent. We should care, when a young woman finds herself in a situation where she's been arrested for a serious crime that was committed, at the behest of an abusive boyfriend. Like, we should care about that context. And so part of the work that we're trying to do at Spero is to persuade decision makers when the goal of correction has been achieved and we've just kind of shifted into mindless retribution, which I think we do a lot in our criminal legal system. Bringing that mitigation to the forefront of all of our cases, explaining not only who was the person then, but who is the person now, and why does that matter? And situating whatever happened that brought them to prison, properly in the context of all that came before and all that's come after, is really kind of our goal. And so if we can get the decision maker on board, then the legal hook.
Yeah. And I also think
becomes easier.
That decision maker, right, is like the question to really pose to them is, when does it become inhumane to continue to incarcerate after someone has, demonstrated or acknowledged it and taken accountability, right? but also transform, right? And then you add on the context, right? The stuff that led up to that decision. When is it humane to continue to incarcerate for 20, 40, 30 years, right?
We tend to value in our society, in our criminal legal system, retribution over everything else. And that's not to say that retribution doesn't have a place in the criminal legal system, but at some point, retribution has to or should give way to other concerns. You know, we need to be weighing, you know, the value of keeping a person in prison well past the point that it's necessary to incapacitate them, you know, with all of the harm that that's doing to that person's family and to the community, you know, not to mention the monetary cost. I mean, it's costly to keep people in prison monetarily and in many other ways, right? But like we seem to just lose sight of that and not recognize that reality and just focus solely on retribution.
So I'm curious, Kristen, as you're talking about getting all the decisions makers in a room and like really focusing the humanity of this person. When you're in those conversations, how do you get the quote unquote opposition, those decision makers, to agree that this is morally the right thing to do?
I mean, I think it's more of a process than just a conversation. But you know, there are several kind of features that are often present in our advocacy. One is that we lean very heavily into accountability and remorse. I often tell my clients, you know, this is going to look and feel very different than any other experience you've had, like in your, you know, journey through the criminal legal process. You know, the traditional criminal, you know, adversarial criminal legal process is predicated on, you know, kind of remaining silent and minimizing responsibility and putting the prosecutions, you know, requiring them to meet their burden of proof. And all those things, you know, may have their place, right? I mean, you know, if you believe in the adversarial criminal legal system, but when, you know, at the point at which we're taking cases, you know, decades later, oftentimes, you know, we're not litigating the facts anymore. And again, this is about the situation as a whole and the person. So we lean very heavily into working with our clients around accountability and remorse. I would say the vast majority of the folks that we've represented and currently represent, like, feel very deeply sorry for what happened to bring them to prison. They carry a tremendous amount of remorse with them every single day, and wish that they could apologize and just haven't been able to kind of process that sometimes or articulate it. So we do that kind of deep, like, heart work with our clients. We work on letters of apology. We have folks assessed for their suitability to participate in high impact dialogues or restorative justice dialogues. You know, those processes have to be initiated by people who have been harmed. But you know, we kind of help our clients demonstrate accountability in every way that they possibly can, and to do their best to show that they are, you know, that they've done, you know, a lot of the hard internal work. I think that's important to decision makers. We have used video as a medium to, you know, produce these mitigation videos where we're featuring our clients, kind of talking about who they were, what they've done, and who they are today, as well as people who know them well, who can contextualize, you know, either, you know, the offense or, you know, what's happened since then. And we also, most of the time, encourage and welcome decision makers to sit down with our clients and have face-to-face conversations with them and meet them, because it's a lot easier to see a person as a human being when you're sitting across the table from them. And we can and we do, you know, write really powerful, you know, petitions and briefs and things like that. But there is something that's really different about that face-to-face human connection. And that's not something that there's often much room for or opportunity for in the earlier phases of criminal cases. Probably one of the most important features of the work that we do is the work around accountability and remorse that we do with our clients.
You touched on two important layers right there. And I believe Spero Justice was the first to kind of really introduce, like, the video, right? Because it's so hard to get to try to, you know, distinguish or, get to know if somebody has really if they're taking accountability, if they had that remorse, on paper, just reading paper, right? So that video is key. And then another step is the in person. But you kind of touched on restorative justice, and can you kind of talk about how that became a part of your work and how you were introduced to it?
I would say one of our kind of core beliefs or tenets is that we, to the extent possible, we want to go about this work delicately and mindfully, and we don't want to inflict further trauma or harm upon people who have already been harmed so much. And so I kind of learned about restorative justice and came to, appreciate the value of restorative justice like through that lens. A lot of my experiences doing capital work, I saw firsthand, like, not only have people experienced tremendous harm, but the criminal legal system like creates its own trauma for folks, just going through that process. And so I felt very strongly that if I can avoid perpetuating harm, I'd like, of course, that's how we need to go about these cases. At the same time, sometimes that's really hard to do. Just reopening these old cases is going to bring things up for folks. It's going to be difficult sometimes, for the people who have been harmed. So sometimes the best we can do and the most we can offer is to make sure that our clients are as fully accountable as they possibly can be. But we just basically want to create the space and the conditions for any kind of healing or restoration that can happen. Whether it's through doing sensitive outreach or having our clients assessed for, these restorative justice dialogues, like we'd like to just create the conditions for healing.
I actually have a follow-up question about that. I'm also serving on a community corrections board. And so I'm seeing one of the things I've noticed recently that sort of has been bothering me as we're thinking about restorative practices. We'll see people come before a review committee, a full board, and they've done a lot of work and like whatever, like they're ready. I've met them personally. I feel like, yep, they've done a lot of programming. They're showing a lot of accountability. Like, I feel like this person would do well in the structure of community corrections. And then victim impact, right? A family member, a loved one, like whomever it is that's speaking, they're angry or they're feeling however they're feeling. And I'm hearing a lot that they haven't gotten an apology. They don't know what's happened with the person. And they clearly don't realize that when the case is happening, like to the point you made, like in that sort of retaliatory, don't speak, don't say anything, don't apologize, you're not allowed to reach out to the person, the family, or whatever the situation is. Like, I see so many people who don't even know that there's a letter bank, that don't even know a restorative process is potentially available, and that they have to initiate it. And so I'm curious, how can you have a productive conversation around, do you know this is possible?
Yeah. It's really, really hard, and sometimes I think what happens is, folks are not given the right kind of support in the first place. Right at the ground level of the criminal legal process during the trial and immediately thereafter. They're not, none of that's explained to them. Like you just said, I think it's a huge challenge, right? And then as humans, we fill in the blanks, right, with our own narratives.
And the worst possible narrative.
And then we hang on. Any gaps in information we have, we fill in. That's human nature. It's totally natural to do that. And then we hang on to those narratives. And sometimes for decades, it's just really tough to go back and, expect somebody to change that narrative.
That mindset. Yeah.
I am so inspired by I mean, I know, Michael, you're involved in the RJ community as well. And, just hearing from the folks who have been harmed, who have participated in these dialogues, like I really do believe in how powerful and healing it can be for people. I think they are incredible evangelists for,
Yes, definitely.
the power of restorative justice.
So we had a something recently where several family members were very adamant. We do not want this person released. No, we don't want them in the community. No, we don't feel safe. There were comments like, we've never gotten an apology and they deserve to rot in prison and all the things you hear, right? And a couple of us were like, no, wait a minute. According to the data, we see he's done all this programming. The letter he wrote to us illustrates he's very remorseful. He very much regrets, youthful decisions he made while self-medicating. We feel like the structure of community corrections would really benefit him. And one of the family members who had been so adamantly opposed was like, oh, well, hold on. I've never heard that before. I didn't even know they had access to programming. I didn't know that they had been doing, like, they were at least willing to open their mind up a little bit, like to that narrative you were talking about, of they were at least willing to consider, oh, well, maybe they are ready for community. And that's the sort of thing that's just making me think about how do we help bridge that gap?
Yeah. I don't know.
Me neither.
I'd like to be able to do it all ourselves, but I don't think we can.
Right.
I think we need the folks in, DOC victim services and the prosecutors and, the other system actors to share some responsibility on that level.
So, Kristen, like we've already talked about a crystal ball. We've already talked about a little bit like systemic change, right? And like your 20 some odd year career, you're still fighting some of the same fights that you started with. And so I'm curious, like, if you can peer into the Spero crystal ball, when we're looking at this, like, is systemic change possible? Like, is there going to be a day where we're not having to fight this same fight? Or is like the purpose of your life and your personal mission to just take these small wins where you get them?
I think it's both. I have to believe that system change is possible because otherwise I wouldn't be doing this, Is it an uphill battle? Of course. Are we ever going to get to the promised land? Prison abolition, I don't know. But I think what's important is to have a goal that has integrity, right? That we're not just going to pick off the low-hanging fruit and continue with that approach, because I think that's going to be really harmful, to where we ultimately end up. So, will we ever get there? Maybe not in my lifetime, but do I believe in things that I haven't seen or haven't yet seen? I do, right? But in the meantime, I derive a tremendous amount of joy and purpose from freeing people on an individual level. I think that's really meaningful and important work, even if it doesn't change any system. Each person who is freed from a virtual life or actual life sentence, who gets to walk out of prison and hug their family and contribute to society, that's the best kind of narrative change that we can possibly have. Folks like you guys and the other, directly impacted people that work, with CRJ, you guys are the ones who have the true power to change the hearts and minds. And so doing that, hard individual, chipping away, at, just freedom for individual folks, for me, will never get old, and brings me just a tremendous amount of joy and purpose, even if we don't reach,
the summit,
it's about, the journey is a really beautiful and important one.
Once again, I'm JoyBelle Phelan.
And I'm Michael Clifton.
Unlocking Change is a production of Colorado Radio for Justice. You can catch a fresh episode of Unlocking Change every first Friday of the month on our airwaves, or find it on demand on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.